Good evening, everybody. In 2015, Ramesh Ponnuru was named one of Politico's top 50 American political thinkers, alongside his wife, April. So, quite the power couple. Since 2022, he has been the editor of the National Review. He is a columnist for the Washington Post and has been a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute since 2012. Mr. Ponnuru is sometimes identified as a champion of the Reform conservative movement, calling for a revival of conservatism in modern Republican policy. He's been a long-standing voice in support for child tax credit policies, and his bipartisan success in this initiative is indicative of his role in shaping contemporary political debates. A big thank you to the government department for sponsoring this event, moderated by the infamous department chair Joseph Reiser and sophomore Aubrey Costello. And with that, we are thrilled to welcome Ramesh Ponnuru to this week's edition of In the News.
Well, infamy. Well, Ramesh, thank you for coming. And let me start by asking, since we got a bit of it in the introduction, not all conservatives are the same, or maybe this administration, though a Republican administration, is maybe not that conservative. So can you tell us a little bit about the American right and situate yourself and maybe the administration in this broader picture?
Well, I'd rather learn why you're so infamous. But maybe we'll table that until afterward. Yes, there are, and always have been, many different kinds of conservative. The modern conservative movement is often thought to date back to 1955, when National Review, the magazine that I edit, was founded by William F. Buckley, Jr. And the idea was to bring together strands of American political thought that hadn't always been easily fit together. In particular, a kind of social conservatism, or traditionalism as it would have been called back then, along with a free market libertarian approach to domestic policies. And third, the third sort of leg of the stool, as it eventually came to be described, and a strong anti-totalitarian U.S. interest-based foreign policy based on a strong defense. And National Review has largely stuck with those ideas. Obviously, the particular mix of issues and the circumstances to which they apply change over time, but that's where National Review stands, and that is, you have room in a movement so constituted for people with different emphases. There were always people who were much more fervent about the social issues and didn't care so much about getting taxes down, and vice versa. Now, this administration, really the Trump movement of the last 10 years, has posed a pretty serious challenge to our brand of conservatism, and to some degree has eclipsed our brand of conservatism. We often agree with things that the administration has done. In fact, given Trump's own history politically, it's usually a matter of his having come around to views that we espoused a long time before he did. But there are also some issues where we have some pretty serious disagreements, and there's a range of opinions about his personal leadership at the magazine. I would say there are a lot of his policies I don't like, and I also don't like nearly all of his personality.
Fair enough. So are there two policies you do like, and are there two that you are really especially against?
Well, you have to pick a day for some of these issues.
Today.
Well, let me say, and sometimes it's not even the particular issue where I like or dislike it. It's the individual issue I have to give a mixed assessment. So, for example, I think that he's absolutely right to say that our European allies need to shoulder a larger share of the defense burden. They need to increase their military budgets. But I say that because I want a stronger Western alliance, not because I think that we ought to abandon the Western alliance, which is, I think, the direction in which he often pushes it. On immigration, another example, I guess you'd call me an immigration hawk. I do think that it's important to enforce the immigration laws. And I do think that we should reformulate our immigration policies so they are more about recruiting people with the skills our economy needs, a little bit less about reuniting extended families. That said, I think that the way he has gone about it is going to entail the maximum level of cruelty and disruption for the minimum amount of sustainable reform. And so am I for what he says? In some ways, I think that he is more correct, certainly, than Biden, whose policy was a complete shambles. But overall, no, I can't approve of it.
That's fair. Shifting more towards a specific issue. So we see that starting in 1973, Roe v. Wade becomes an electorally effective rallying point for the Conservative Party. However, since its reversal in 2022, we've seen that it's remained legal in 31 states and only partially restricted in 7. Now that the Republican Party no longer has the cause of abortion as a campaign point, has the Supreme Court's success of the pro-life movement turned into an example of the proverbial dog that caught the car?
Great, large question. The thing there was obviously a giant political backlash to Dobbs and to the resulting abortion bans in many states and abortion restrictions in other states. But I think that the extent of that backlash has often been overstated. And so the first election after Dobbs comes out, you see every pro-life incumbent governor is reelected, including several in swing states who had themselves signed laws that restricted or prohibited abortions, and the Republicans take control of the House in those same elections. If you look at the exit polling from AP Votecast, it does look as though the issue damaged Republicans on net, although not nearly as much as, say, immigration did for the Democrats. What I think, and I should, before I go into further, I should just put my own cards on the table that I am very much committed to the pro-life cause. I even wrote a book about it some years ago. I do think that my fellow pro-lifers have made a number of serious mistakes in the run-up to Dobbs and following Dobbs. One was the idea that once you got rid of Roe v. Wade, that meant victory. And that meant everything we wanted in policy was we should go full speed ahead. And I think actually what it meant was we could have a democratic debate and be able to build a consensus on this issue without the courts standing in the way of that. And I think that's been a painful reorientation for a lot of pro-life activists. And then the other thing, of course, was that the states in which you were most likely to have success in restricting abortion also tend to be poorer states, states with a variety of negative social outcomes with respect to their health care, with respect to their education system. And pro-lifers needed to do a better job of bolstering those systems and making it easier for women in difficult circumstances who are pregnant and their children. There have been some efforts along those lines in some of the states, but not nearly enough. And just speaking sort of, again, crassly politically, it also just hasn't been enough of the pro-life message.
That's fair. Kind of continuing on this thread, I'm curious about tying in the concept of religion here. When we had Mark Short came and spoke last semester, feels like a year ago.
Every week feels like a year.
It really does. He made a clear discussion about the importance of faith to his belief in being pro-life, and I want to discuss faith here for a second. So we traditionally think about religion as oftentimes guiding politics, like with the pro-life movement. I'm curious now if you think that we're starting to see politics guiding religion with the rise of influencer religion, per se.
Yeah, I think that to some extent the political polarization that's affected every other part of American life is influencing American religion in, I think, a pretty negative way. One of the interesting things you can see, and so a couple data points that I think really show this. In 2012, there was a poll of Americans, and it subdivided them based on self-described religious affiliation. And Americans who describe themselves as evangelical Christian were most likely to say that a political leader's character was of great importance. Something like 72% of them said that that was of vital importance. And then you asked 4 years later it's down to 27%. And we all understand why that changed and who caused that change. These days, interestingly, people seem to be more likely to describe themselves as evangelical Christians, not on the basis of actually going to church, but on the basis of a kind of mood or a kind of political affiliation. And I think that one of the things we're seeing is in our politics is a post-religious right that is, and I think a lot of people, particularly on the left, who disliked the religious right, are finding that the post-religious right is worse.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that, actually. Say more about the post-religious right, because this is that very expression I've heard a lot. You thought you didn't like the religious right.
Right.
Just wait. So tell us about these folks. And they're clearly different from the National Review reading set.
Yeah.
And they're not, well, I'm not sure what they are.
Yeah.
Do you have a better sense?
The new voters who have moved into the Republican Party during the Trump years, it's a trend that predates Trump but accelerated under Trump. They tend to be working class voters, which in the modern American political context is defined in terms of educational degrees. That is, they don't have college degrees or postgraduate degrees. They tend, particularly in 2016, less so since then, they tend to be white voters. They tend to be more rural voters. To wildly generalize, these are not people who make a high priority out of having lower tax rates. They are not interested or maybe even opposed to restrictions on abortion. They are likely to be opposed to reforms of Social Security and Medicare that bring their spending within control. But the issues that most tend to move them are things like immigration, things having to do with perceived slights to patriotism, or to their identity, anything that seems to be hostile to whites or to people who don't have college degrees. Those tend to be the issues that get them going. And it's also it would be remiss of me not to mention on our first annual Liberation Day that this is also a constituency that is either pro-tariff, pro-trade restriction, or likes the symbolism of political leaders saying they're on the side of the working man via tariffs.
Right, and this is one of the great inversions in American politics, right? That 20 years ago, even Mitt Romney, right, was a free trade man. Republicans were traditionally the free trade party. Trump is a protectionist and weirdly declaring protectionism liberation. So what accounts for this?
But even that is, of course, a historical inversion from a previous pattern. If you go back to the 1930s,
that's right.
The 1920s and 30s, it was the Republicans who were the protectionists. And of course, Trump explicitly harkens back to the tradition of especially William McKinley, about whom I suspect the only thing he knows is that he was for tariffs.
I kind of wanted to get on this point of an idea of flipping in political parties. I'm curious if you think that we're about to see this, or if this is just kind of a blip, not really something that's indicative of a larger pattern.
Well, the funny thing is, we can easily look at all of these things that have changed and been in flux in our politics, and yet, if you compare the electoral map of 2024 to the electoral map of 2000, right, with a very different Republican Party in a lot of ways, very different Democratic Party in a lot of different ways, I think about 43 of the states voted the same way that they did in both elections. So they voted blue in the 2000 election, they voted red in the 2000 election, and they did the same thing in 2024. So I think 4 states went from blue to red, and 3 states went from red to blue. And unfortunately for the Democrats, the red ones were bigger. So it's important to remember when we think about all of these fluctuations, how much continuity there is. The vast majority of people who voted for Trump voted for Mitt Romney as well. That said, I do think you have these kinds of generally glacial changes in politics. And really throughout the developed world, we have seen the education-based realignment where the parties of the left have tended to become parties of people with college and postgraduate degrees, And the parties of the right have tended to be the people who didn't go to college and it even goes further than that, in that the swing vote tends to be the some college voters, people who attended some college but didn't get a degree.
So is there any prospect that we're going to break out of this period of very close contestation where, it seems as though I should have done the math beforehand, but really since the House flipped for that first time under Gingrich, nobody's held a consistent position, right? We win a trifecta. Everybody's expecting the Republicans to lose the House at the midterms. It's going to be an open race, unless there's a third term. No, an unconstitutional third term. Right, there'll be an open race. So is there any prospect of either party breaking out back to a world of, we have a clear majority party, and what would the winning coalition look like?
So the longest stretch of trifecta governance since the Gingrich Revolution in 1994 was 4 years, right? 03 to 07, when you had Republicans in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House. But more typically, the country is willing to put up with about 2 years.
Yeah.
And then it switches, and I suspect that that's what's going to happen this time, although, who knows? I think there are some signs that that's what's going to happen. So the sort of trench warfare politics we've had, I think to some degree is a choice that political elites have made that they present and may even believe is an inevitability. And it sort of feeds on itself. Right now you see Republicans saying, well, we're only going to have the majority for 2 years, so we have to do all of these things. Well, that's exactly what helps produce the 2-year majority, because people don't like the idea that you are cramming down your wish list on the entire country. And one of the reasons we've had this pattern of oscillating and close elections is that each party takes its momentary victories to be vindications of everything it stands for, when in fact it's more repudiation of the other team. So we have an anti-Republican majority and an anti-Democratic majority in our country right now. They're overlapping majorities, and depending on where we are in the cycle, each side just wildly misreads it. So the Democrats, I think, fell into a series of these traps over the last dozen years, really starting with the Obama elections in 2008 and 2012. There was particularly this idea that there was a coalition of the ascendant, that young people were going to be on the left forever, minorities were going to be on the left forever. As the country became less Christian, it was going to move further to the left. And this led the Democrats to make all kinds of mistakes that led them to alienate the actually existing voters of today in favor of the hypothetical voters of tomorrow. And I think one of the results was their defeat in 2024. But I think what the Democrats have going for them is the Republicans. And so they could make a comeback without having learned any lessons from their previous defeats.
I like the phrase that you used, the anti-Democrat and the anti-Republican party. I think that's really interesting. And I'm curious if, as we're starting to see our two parties starting to get more and more closed into themselves and going, I think, further right and further left, I'm curious what you think happened to the center and if that's coming back anytime soon.
Well, one of the myths in politics is that everything is about mobilization of your base and there are no longer any persuadable voters. And it is certainly true that each party comes into an election with a very strong base. The floor for either party is much higher than it used to be. You don't get landslides of the sort that you got, say, the 1984 election, which was a 49-state wipeout of the Democrats by Ronald Reagan. But there are absolutely a decisive group of voters who still swing from one group to another. There absolutely are people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and then voted for Biden, and then voted for Trump again. There are particular counties in Wisconsin where you can see that this pattern was followed. And so I think Tim Walz said the other day that He doesn't think that Democrats can win the 77 million people who voted for Donald Trump, but they can win all these millions of voters who didn't show up. And among the reasons that is a very stupid analysis is that you don't have to win all 77 million voters as a block. You need to pick off like 2 or 3 million of them.
All right, so if you were the White House chief of staff and bringing rationality to the White House, what's their path to an enduring majority? What should they be doing?
Yeah, well, I'd resign. I'd probably write a tell-all book at that point.
I hope you get a large advance.
Thank you. Well, you know, don't be crazy would be a good first step, right? The country didn't like the very lax immigration policy and didn't like the inflation. So work on those two things. And so, for example, on immigration, I would take the Lankford bill from 2024, which had bipartisan buy-in, use it as a starting point, probably move it somewhat to the right. I would add some things like requiring employers to check the legal status of new employees and holding them responsible if they hire illegal immigrants to turn off that economic magnet for increased or future illegal immigration. I would work with, one of the things you'd work with in Congress is tightening up the asylum rules, making sure that it's actual fear of persecution and not just economic concerns, as understandable as those may be. On inflation, I wouldn't be trying to raise the price of everything, you know, across the board. That would be one of the things I would want to do. And then I would try to have a little bit of stability by extending much of the existing tax code while making a few changes here and there, but not, I wouldn't be adding $6 trillion to the deficit, which appears to be the current game plan.
So kind of sticking with this general theme, over the past 72 days, Trump's passed, I believe it's 109 executive orders, at least it was 2 hours ago, it could have changed. Keeping with that, do you think this type of political momentum is sustainable, or does this risk burning out after the 100 days is up?
I think a lot of the executive orders are phony. I mean, I think it's the illusion of action rather than actual action. So take the much discussed executive order allegedly shutting down the Department of Education. Well, what it is actually doing is proposing to Congress a plan to shut down the Department of Education. And the shutting down of the Department of Education would almost entirely take the form of taking its programs and shuffling them to other elements of the bureaucracy. You know, Health and Human Services gets some of it, Treasury gets the student loan portfolio, and so forth. I think to some degree, even DOGE is a way of creating this impression of frenetic activity when not a whole lot is actually happening. If you look at Congress, where I think not only should the main action be, but actually, in fact, where the main policy action is going to be, it's very slow right now. It is not clear at all to me that they are even making progress toward the big, gigantic bill they're going to try to fold everything into and pass while bypassing a filibuster. In fact, and I talk to people in Washington all the time about this, I think people are underestimating the chance that they cannot ultimately get anything, that they are not going to be able to pass a reconciliation bill.
And what happens when you can't pass that bill?
I think it becomes, well, I think there is a big question mark as to how much tolerance Trump's voters have for nothing happening. He can start, you know, social media fights and throw out a lot of shiny objects, which will get a lot of his people on board. He can blame other people if things go badly. He can blame, you know, Mike Johnson if needed. He can blame Mark Carney, or, you know, if the trade war doesn't go well. But is the percentage of his support that peels off if things go badly, is it 5%, or is it 15%? I think we just don't know the answer to that question, but I think a lot hangs on it.
That's fair, that's fair.
All right, foreign policy, before we open it up to the floor. So you were critical of the administration. You're at, yes, the Europeans need to pay more, but no, Trump seems to be actually calling into question the Western alliance. So I guess, what is it that makes you think he's questioning the Western alliance? Like, get into granular specifics there a little bit. And like, what should we be doing with Ukraine? Like, should we not be, I don't know, taking their minerals or whatever it is we're threatening to do now?
Yeah, the funny thing about Trump's allegedly isolationist foreign policy is, to a large degree, it's like a caricature of imperialism, because he wants the mineral rights. In Ukraine, he wants to annex Greenland, and possibly by force. It's almost as though there is no thought out doctrine, but a series of impulses of an unstable person. With respect to Ukraine, I don't think that it is likely or a realistic U.S. aim to restore the border circa 2013 or even circa January 2022, nor do I think that NATO membership in any near term is a realistic possibility or a legitimate war aim for the United States. I do think that we should be trying to get a deal that allows for a defensible Ukraine with territorial integrity. That may take the form of security guarantees, may take the form of Western and ideally not exclusively American troops. But the key obstacle to that is Putin. And I don't see the rhetorical recognition from this administration that that is the case. I see a lot more insults of the Western allies than kind of cajoling or prodding or encouraging them. And then I see a bunch of gratuitous policy changes that don't make sense except as preludes to an abandonment of NATO. So, for example, not nominating an American to run NATO for the first time. That, I think, is a sign of a not especially benign neglect.
Very good. I think we're at the point in the conversation when we're supposed to open it up to the audience, and I think Chloe has her first question.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. I'm Chloe. I'm a sophomore history and global studies student from San Diego, California. So we all just saw, and you just talked about, how Trump is going to officially begin the process of dissolving the Department of Education. And obviously, you said this is going to be a disaster, as these tasks and jobs within here will just be delegated to other spaces, and I totally agree with that. So my question for you is, what do you think is a more effective conservative approach to education policy, one that actually reduces federal involvement rather than just reorganizing it?
Yeah, I think if what you were after was improving the federal role in education and reducing the federal footprint, there are a lot of things that you could do. I think actually those would have more to do with higher education, where I think the federal government has played a very big role in shaping the structure of that large segment of American life, than K-12, which really has been much more of a state and local matter. And one of the reasons federal efforts to reform K-12 education generally don't get very far is precisely because something like 85 to 90% of school funding is generated at the local and state level. So the federal government just doesn't have the leverage to do a lot. And I think we should recognize that, and whatever we want to do for federal education policy should build on that basic insight. One thing that I think that we should do, that the Doge folks have threatened, is maintain a database where we have statistics on educational outcomes by states, and we can tell which states are doing better and which states are doing worse, because every state government is going to have an incentive to pretend that everything is just going up and up and up. And one of the few constructive things the federal government has done in this area has been to say, no, actually, you are still 50th. in terms of higher education, an enormous amount, I think, could be done in terms of opening up the accreditation monopoly, so you have different kinds of institutions, changing the student loan rules, so different kinds of programs like apprenticeships, in addition to colleges, could receive federal aid, and restructuring the loans also, so that they're not just mechanisms to increase tuition. There have been any number of proposals to do that. One would be to create just a large line of credit and consolidate a bunch of the existing federal programs. But I'd be looking at stuff like that. Oh, and then one other thing I would do is try to restructure some of the Title I aid. This is K-12, and it's supposedly for poor kids, but it ends up going to 95% of U.S. school districts because that's the way to keep the program going. So it would be very thorny politically to try to reform that and refocus it where it should be, but I think that would be worth doing if you could do it.
And Serena is next.
Hi, I'm Serena. I'm a senior government major. Earlier tonight, you mentioned the declining quality of care for many American families, especially during the birthing period. Maine specifically has been hit incredibly hard by this. 10 of the state's birthing units have closed in the past 15 years, including the one here in Waterville. Mm-hmm. This means that family planning clinics have become the nexus of prenatal and often care for families across the state, including general practice. Considering today the Trump administration pulled Title X funding for family planning clinics in 8 states, including Maine, which cuts off $2 million to these clinics providing health care throughout the state. I'm curious what your vision is for a Republican Party that is both pro-life and pro-family, and where family planning clinics fit into that picture.
Yeah, well, so much of the decision making from the administration when it comes to cutting off these programs, it's legally questionable at best, and seems to be motivated by spite at particular governors, like your governor, rather than any overarching policy consideration. So, number one, stop doing that, I guess, would be my my idea. I think there are a lot of what you're talking about. I think has to raise the question of our overall healthcare system and how we reform that. And there are, I think, things that but neither party really wants to go back to healthcare at all because it's been such a minefield for 20 years. But the consolidation of hospitals, I think, has been in a lot of ways abetted by the way Medicaid and Medicare work. And there are things that we can do to change that. We can have site-neutral payment systems, for example. But I do think you have to look at those kind of system-level changes if you're going to make headway on those problems.
All right, I'm going to go to the deck of cards. We had, 15 here, so we won't get through them all, but there are a couple that popped out, so I'm going to just read this. As a conservative thinker of Indian heritage, how do you respond? Thanks. Well, it's could have been anybody. Could have been kind of a misplaced modifier here. Sure. Anyway, how do you respond to the argument that conservatism, particularly in the United States, has often been aligned with policies and rhetoric that disadvantage racial minorities? Do you see a distinction between conservative principles and how they have been applied in practice?
Yeah. I'm probably one of the very few Americans who can say that he's been microaggressed against by the Dalai Lama, who said to me something about, "Oh, you're from India," and without even really thinking much, "Oh, I'm from Kansas."
Yeah.
And he looked kind of baffled by that, but that'll go in that tell-all.
Microaggressed
That'll go
by
in the
the
tell-all.
Dalai Lama. That should be in your.
Look, historically, both parties, to different degrees at different times, have depended on votes from people who are bigoted, particularly people who, by today's standards, count as bigoted. I think any objective look at at racial attitudes, like, do you support interracial marriage? Do you believe that people should be allowed to discriminate on the basis of race and housing? So all of those things have plunged over the last 50, 60 years. But there's more of it than one would like, and I've certainly been exposed to more of it since the birth of social media than I had been previously. I guess it's just there's political leaders in particular can take people's mixed bag of sentiments and emotions and help guide them in a better direction or in a worse direction. So I often think of how Bill Clinton in the 1990s handled issues related to welfare and to crime, which sometimes, the political sentiment around those was often pretty ugly, but there were also legitimate issues that had to be confronted, and he confronted those issues while not trying, at least not to cater to the ugliness, and I think had a good effect in that way. And then I think subsequent generations of Democrats really forgot that. And on the Republican side, I think, George W. Bush, I had lots of differences with him at the time, but he tried to play a constructive role in that regard as well. One of the, Trump does not feel any compulsion to call anybody to their better angels.
No, but very true. On the level of principle, maybe, to ask, I think that there might be a clear divergence between, the sort of DEI conception where, departures from racial proportionality are presumptively bad, measures to bring about racial proportionality are presumptively good. The current administration has sort of vigorously dismantled that, or tried to, and at least purports to speak for a kind of race-neutral liberalism. So I guess if you accept the premise that those are different principles, which one do you accept?
So if you look at the executive order on, there are a couple executive orders, but the one on DEI, they basically end up again and again saying, to the extent it's compatible with the law, to the extent it follows the law. And I do think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if you look at the text of it, it says, for example, educational programs that receive federal assistance cannot discriminate or give preference on the basis of race. And there's no asterisk that says, but it's okay if your intentions are good. And so it seems to me that that on the law, on those questions, they are straightforwardly right. And I think that even if they had not issued those sorts of orders, the courts were moving in that direction anyway.
All right, another one from the deck, and then we'll go to the audience. Given the potential deportation of a tough student based on an opinion piece the student wrote about Israel, and there's also been targeting from this administration and pressuring tech giants, what is your diagnosis regarding the health of free speech in America today?
It's seen better days, and I think you've seen unfavorable trends in the opinion polling, both left and right. And then, leaving aside the Tufts case, where the administration has not been totally forthcoming about the factual basis for its actions, which is a running theme in some of its deportation actions. There's also the fact that Trump repeatedly says that CBS should lose its license, which I guess means the CBS affiliate station should lose their license because they make editorial decisions he disagrees with. This is not just a sporadic thing on his part. He has for years said things like that people should not be allowed to write hit pieces, for example. Well, there's a great standard for the law. Oh, this one's a hit piece, so it's not allowed. So he's hostile to free speech. I don't see any way around that, and it's a big problem. I do think that the judicial appointees he put on the bench in his first term, at least, were considerably better than him on this sort of question. And one of the questions about a second term is going to be what kinds of appointments does he make this time, and also how well do the first and second term appointees weather the pressure that he is going to put them under? And that, I think, is an open question.
So the audience, do we have hands? Or I can keep going to the deck because I have plenty here. Oh, Carter.
Hi, I'm Carter. I'm a sophomore Gov Global Studies major. As of a few hours ago, Susan Crawford won the Wisconsin Supreme Court race against Elon Musk's $21 million backed Brad Schimmel. What impact do you think Elon's money being defeated will have on non-MAGA Republicans in Congress? Will we see more challenges to Trump if an Elon-backed primary challenge isn't as much of a threat?
Well, I don't think any of them are concluding that an Elon-backed primary challenge isn't much of a threat because of the way a general election went in Wisconsin. I think what happened in Wisconsin is a result of a couple factors. One, typically when you've got a party in power in the White House, the out party is more energized and the in party is a little bit more complacent. And that has been pronounced in recent years because of the exact shift that we've been talking about in our politics, when you had a lot more working class voters come into the Republican Party and a lot more voters with college degrees leave the Republican Party for the Democratic Party. There used to be an advantage that Republicans had in turnout. In low turnout elections, the people who would always show up to vote tended to be Republicans. The evidence we have been seeing for the last 3 or 4 years suggests that that is in the process of flipping, and that Democrats now have a structural advantage in lower turnout elections, which certainly include judicial elections that are not being held in November. And so even under Biden, I think that's one of the reasons the Democrats did relatively well in the midterms in 2022, and they did quite well in some of the special elections then. And I think we're seeing that trend continue. I think that's one of the reasons why the Florida special elections yesterday for the 2 vacant House seats, all the Republicans won them. They didn't win them by anything close to the margins that Trump had won those districts, or that the previous Republican congressman had won those districts. So I suspect people are going to conclude all of the reasons we had to think that the midterms will have an advantage for the Democrats are probably still in play. I don't think that's going to make Republicans change a lot of their behavior, though, because they still worry about a primary challenge, and they worry more about a primary challenge than they worry about the general election. Because even if they end up losing, 30 seats because there's a Democratic wave, the vast majority of them are still going to get reelected, and there's more danger to them of losing a primary than there is of losing the general election. That, I think, has to do with the way our primaries are structured, and it explains quite a lot about the way our congressional politics works or doesn't work.
Okay. Well, I'll go to the deck and wait for the audience. So here you go. While President Trump and Republicans have been largely dismissive of climate change, do you see climate change as a moral imperative tied to your pro-life stance? If so, how do you think the GOP and its base can shift toward a more constructive and forward-looking approach on the issue?
Yeah. I do think that climate change is real and poses real threats to the United States and to the world. And I think that that a set of conservative policy solutions on this have to be about mitigating risk, encouraging adaptation and resiliency, funding research, that may take the form of having large government prizes administered by the Department of Energy to make breakthroughs in basic research on things like carbon sequestration and so forth. I am not a fan of carbon rationing policies of the form of cap and trade, or even a carbon tax, all of which seem to me, to face insuperable political obstacles based on the fact that Americans, left, right, and center, don't actually want to make that kind of economic trade-off, and also not to have the kind of not to have a favorable cost-benefit ratio.
Okay, another from the audience. Do we have everybody? Who do we have over here? Joe.
Hi there. My name is Joe. I'm a senior gov major. And I'm interested in digging into more of this kind of balance between Trump and Congress. My analysis is a bit in 2016 and in the following few years, there was a gentleman's agreement that Trump didn't put up anyone for his cabinet that was so out there, and Congress approved all these people. Now, not the same anymore. That gentleman's agreement doesn't exist, and he's got a lot of people that I've saw that you criticized. Some of them, RFK was one that came up, that he's put up all his people, and Congress has just rolled over and let him pretty much put in anyone he wants. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the future of the, kind of your wing and beliefs of the conservative movement in the next few years? And is there a chance that there will be any standing up to Trump in terms of nominees and in terms of legislation and desires, or is it going to be 3, at least maybe 1.5, and then maybe 3 years of a lot of chaos and just rolling right over?
Well, obviously the Trump people, Trump himself and the people right around him, their diagnosis of what went wrong, to the extent anything went wrong in the first term, is that people weren't sufficiently loyal to him. He didn't have people who were committed to, his agenda, and Republicans were too weak, and the congressional allies were too weak. I think that's just fundamentally mistaken, in that there are basic problems that are hard to root around if you've got a head of a branch of government who doesn't have a ton of executive function. And it was his own lack of seriousness, follow through, commitment, and decisiveness that was the problem. And I don't think that that's gotten better. I think it's probably gotten worse. And so I don't think that the outcomes are going to be markedly better this time. Now, as to whether that will actually occasion any Republican pushback, this obviously could be wishful thinking on my part. I do think that we are at, or maybe even a little bit past, peak Trump in terms of his hold on the Republican Party and at least some of the people who have been supporting him. One of the things that's happened in the last few months, he's had the traditional advantages of a first-term president and a second-term president. Like a first-term president, he can have all of these executive orders that just undo the executive orders of his predecessor. The same as George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and himself in his first term. But he also has this vindication of having been reelected, which is traditionally kind of when any of these people seem to be at their summit. That's when Barack Obama gave his second inaugural address, where he had all of these it was a little pie in the sky, and none of it ended up happening. And George W. Bush did the same sort of thing in 2005 with his inaugural address, and everybody was talking about a permanent Republican majority, which then, was gone in 18 months. So I do wonder if his numbers are in the low 40s, high 30s, if the Republicans are resigned to the fact that they're going to lose a lot of seats, whether it becomes, you only need a slight weakening of discipline in the party for him not to be able to get his way on a lot of things. And then the other question is what is the future of the Republican Party post-Trump? And that, I think you'd have to say that Vance has an inside track to the nomination. He is more likely than any other person to be our next president. But if Trump is seen as a failure in 2028, then that nomination becomes much, much less worth having. And if that happens, then, so if the Democrats win in 2028, for example, then I think it's not obvious that the Republican Party remains a Trumpist party. I think some of the political formula, the working class orientation, the being more anti-immigration than previous Republicans, to some degree, even though I don't personally like it, the anti-trade orientation, some of this stuff has a real political constituency, but I wonder how much it would have if it were divorced from the aspects of his personality and his celebrity that drew him his initial support. I mean, this guy was a celebrity when I was 12 years old. You know, he had The Art of the Deal. I mean, he was in the Home Alone movies. He's in an REM song, right, in the 1980s. He's just, and JD, I can call him JD because I've known him forever. He has a lot of talents, but he's not Trump.
How about over here, Wilson?
Thank you. I'm Wilson. Recently, we've seen AOC take her show on the road with Bernie Sanders to give a series of rallies, as well as Cory Booker give a 25-hour speech on the Senate floor. These seem to be the first signs of life for the Democrats in a few months. Mm-hmm. That's to say, who will be the nominee in 2028, and what do they need to do
Yeah.
to win?
Well, I mean, I think there's just enormous Democratic frustration right now, and that's manifested itself in a variety of ways, because it's no fun being shut out of power. And that's a little glib. I mean, all these things are happening, and they don't feel like they can do anything about it, and they feel powerless, and they hate what's happening. So all of that's understandable. They don't have a leader. That is inevitable when you've lost all three branches of government. And Hakeem Jeffries does not have national recognition. Schumer does have national recognition, but it's not the good kind. And even though I think he made the right tactical decision in not shutting down the government, he himself, I think he has reached a point, he has passed a point of diminishing returns for his leadership of the Democratic Party. So this is inevitably going to be a time of frustration. Different Democrats are going to have to put themselves out there and be assessed by other Democrats, by voters, to some degree, by the media, by donors, and they're just going to have to see what works and what doesn't work. What strikes me in looking at the polling from the Democrats is there is a lot of appetite for fighting back, a lot of appetite for combativeness, not so much for ideological leftism. And if you look at the first term reaction to Trump, the 2018 cycle where the Democrats gained, I think, 41 seats in the House, which is quite a lot. The vast majority of those were moderate suburban Democrats who were pretty careful about how they were positioned. And then there were, 4 or 5 people who'd won primaries in deep blue Democratic districts who then ended up kind of defining the year and the party because they were so mediagenic, and AOC was one of them. I think that actually ended up having a kind of negative effect on the Democrats. It led them to draw the wrong lessons as to the nature of that Democratic reaction and the nature of the political center. It seems to me that the winning formula for the Democrats is going to be somebody who is not afraid of Donald Trump, who is willing to engage on the vast range of issues, including some of the issues which are seen as Democratic weaknesses, like immigration, but is not somebody who is obsessed with catering to the most vocally left-wing online presences in the Democratic Party, who are not going to say, as Kamala Harris did, yeah, absolutely, taxpayer-funded sex reassignment surgery for prisoners and illegal immigrants, who are going to see, well, you know what? I think that is maybe pretty far down the list of voter priorities, and I'm not going to answer questionnaires from groups that want to put me on the spot on a bunch of issues where most voters think that's a little weird. That, I think, nobody pays me to be a Democratic strategist, but that would be my sense of it.
Well, I haven't been over here, so.
Hi, my name is Austin. I'm a sophomore. What's one thing that you think the Democrats do very well that the Republicans can use or adapt to see more electoral success?
You know, I think of it more in the past tense at the moment. I mean, you know, Democrats certainly had this aura of coolness for generations. And it's only recently that they've kind of abandoned that edge and have become more like people you cringe at. And I'm not sure what exactly they can do to recapture that, except you know, things like generational change that people like Schumer need to move on. And let me say, even though I don't agree with almost anything that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, and as I said, I think in some ways she's had a negative effect on the party, I think they were absolutely foolish not to let her have a leadership role in the Democratic Party, because if she's willing to be constructive and she's willing to speak for the party as a whole while recognizing there are different branches of it, that, it seems to me, is the kind of thing that they need. She's obviously got energy. She's obviously got committed, excited followers, so why not try to put that in some constructive direction? And yes, I know I dodged your question. I don't have a good answer for it.
How about the middle here?
Hi, my name's Anish. I'm a junior neuroscience major. And my question was going back to your pro-life stance, which was the GOP has been a party that has preached small government and reducing the control of government over American families. How does that ideal align with the pro-life ideology and therefore removal of choice allowed to Americans when it comes to their own bodies?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this fundamentally gets down to the core question that is the neuralgic question at the center of the debate, right? It's a question of individual rights. And if you think that the unborn child is an individual member of the human species to whom rights attach, you're going to have a set of answers that follow from that. And if you don't think that, you're going to have the opposite set of answers. It's interesting that if you look at the Libertarian Party, which obviously, sometimes to a fault, tries to think through these questions from first principles about, let's have a small government that just protects individual rights against aggression and coercion, they always end up being split on this issue. And several of their presidential nominees over the years have been people who, precisely on the basis of believing that unborn children have individual rights, have ended up being pro-life. And others haven't. It just the libertarian principle of small government, the libertarian principle of leave me alone, just doesn't by itself furnish enough premises to settle the question. You have to avert to other principles and other considerations about what is this entity and does it have rights, and if so, how are those rights recognized?
Perfect.
Is it time for the rapid fire questions?
Those weren't?
Faster. Your answers have to be snappy, and I think Aubrey is going to put you on the spot.
Sounds good. First one, annexing Greenland, yay or nay?
Nay, come on.
How about the Solomon Islands, though? Same deal as them.
I need to know a little bit more about vacation spots in the Solomon Islands. Yeah.
Sounds good. Is seeking the death penalty for CEO killer Luigi Maggioni reasonable?
I'm against the death penalty. I think when you have the option of not taking a human life, you don't take a human life. And you can prevent him from causing any more damage to anybody without killing him. That said, if you were going to have a death penalty, which I don't believe in, this does seem to be the kind of case in which you would want to execute.
Fair. First thing you notice when you meet a political leader?
Honestly, how stiff is the hair? That's the.
Not the small hands.
But there's more, right? I mean, also, like, some of them are real touchers. You know, and some of them aren't. I mean, and you can tell some of them are occasionally you find somebody who's an introvert who has just really fought himself or herself and overcome that. Those tend to be the ones that I like the most, and they don't tend to do well. So.
Fair enough. Last two, who's your favorite president?
Ever? My lifetime?
In your lifetime.
All right, because I mean, I think you kind of, if it's ever you have to go with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, they're both, it's hard to surpass them. In my lifetime, come on, I'm a Reaganite conservative. What do you think?
Fair enough. Last question. What class should everyone take in college?
Personal finance. Also because I'm a conservative. Also because my daughter is a sophomore and she took a personal finance class, and I feel much better about her future now.
Well, very good. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're welcome.
And thank you to the audience.